The morning sun cast long shadows across the rebuilt streets of New Haven, but Maya Chen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stood at the window of her apartment on the 15th floor, watching the city wake up below. The skyscrapers gleamed with fresh glass and steel, their surfaces reflecting a world that had been reborn from ashes. But Maya remembered what this place looked like before, when the buildings were rubble and the streets ran red with blood. It had been 15 years since the collapse. 15 years since the world had nearly ended, and humanity had clawed its way back from the brink. Most people preferred not to think about those dark days anymore. They called it the rebuild era now, as if giving it a prettier name could erase the horror of what had come before. Maya was one of the survivors. One of the few who had lived through the worst of it and helped drag civilization back from the grave. She wore the scars of those days on her body and in her soul, a twisted left arm that had never healed properly, a network of fine lines around her eyes from years of squinting through smoke and ash, and a permanent wariness that made her sleep with a knife under her pillow even now. The younger generation called them ghosts, the survivors who couldn't let go of the past. They said it with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if the people who had sacrificed everything to rebuild the world were now just embarrassing reminders of an unpleasant chapter in history. Maya's phone buzzed. A text from her supervisor at the city planning office, needing moved to 9 a.m. New development project needs approval. She sighed and turned away from the window. At 42, Maya had spent the last decade working to help plan the city's continued expansion. It was good work, meaningful work, but lately she'd been feeling more and more like a relic. The bright young architects and engineers who filled the offices talked about sustainable growth and smart city integration as if they were the first people to ever think about building something better. They had no idea what better really meant. Maya grabbed her coffee and headed out into the morning bustle. The streets were clean and efficient now, with electric buses humming quietly along dedicated lanes and pedestrian walkways lined with carefully maintained trees. It was beautiful, she had to admit. Everything they'd dreamed of building during those long, dark nights when the world was ending. The city planning office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower in the downtown district. Maya badged in and took the elevator to the 8th floor, where she found her team already assembled in the conference room. There was Jake Morrison, 28 years old and fresh out of graduate school, with his perfectly styled hair and expensive suit. Sarah Kim, 31, who had a PhD in urban development and talked about optimizing human flow patterns as if people were data points in a spreadsheet. And David Chen, no relation, despite the shared last name, who at 35 was the oldest of the group besides Maya, and who had the distinction of being the only one who occasionally asked her opinion about something. "Maya, glad you could make it," said Director Harrison, a thin man in his 50s who had been appointed to run the department 2 years ago. He'd moved to New Haven from the West Coast, where he'd helped plan the reconstruction of San Francisco after the collapse. "We've got an exciting opportunity this morning." Maya took her seat at the table and opened her tablet. On the screen was a development proposal for a massive residential and commercial complex on the east side of the city. The renderings showed soaring towers connected by sky bridges, with shopping centers and office buildings integrated into a single, sprawling structure. Meridian Corporation wants to build a new district, Harrison continued. They're calling it New Horizon. It would house 50,000 people and provide 30,000 jobs. The investment is enormous, we're talking about $12 billion. Jake leaned forward eagerly. The environmental impact studies look fantastic. They're using all the latest green technology, and the energy efficiency ratings are off the charts. And the population density projections show it would reduce traffic congestion by 15%, Sarah added. The AI models predict a significant improvement in quality of life metrics. Maya studied the proposal, her frown deepening. The planned location was in the Eastern District, where some of the city's oldest neighborhoods still stood. Not the original old, those had been destroyed in the collapse, but the communities that had grown up in the immediate aftermath, when survivors had cobbled together homes from whatever materials they could find. "What about the existing residents?" Maya asked. Harrison waved a hand dismissively. "The area is mostly low-income housing anyway. Meridian is offering generous relocation packages. The residents will be better off." "Have you talked to them?" "Well, no, but..." Director Harrison, Maya interrupted, I'd like to visit the site before we make any decisions. I want to see what we're talking about replacing. Sarah rolled her eyes. Maya, we have comprehensive satellite imagery and ground surveys. We know exactly what's there. I want to see it with my own eyes. There was an uncomfortable silence. Maya could feel the weight of their collective judgment. She was being difficult again, asking inconvenient questions, slowing down progress. She'd been in meetings like this before, where the bright young minds grew impatient with the old woman who couldn't embrace the future. Fine, Harrison said finally. Take the morning. But I want a decision by end of day. This is a major opportunity, and we can't afford to let it slip away. Maya left the office and drove east through the city. The neighborhoods gradually changed as she moved away from the gleaming downtown core. The buildings grew shorter and more weathered, the streets narrower and more crowded. This was where the Real City lived, not the showcase districts that appeared in tourism brochures, but the working neighborhoods where people raised families and built communities. She parked her car at the edge of the area marked for development and walked the rest of the way. The first thing she noticed was the garden. It sprawled across what had once been a vacant lot, with raised beds full of vegetables and fruit trees that had been carefully nurtured for years. An elderly man was tending to a patch of tomatoes, his movements careful and deliberate. Excuse me, Maya said, approaching him. I'm with the city planning department. I'm looking at the neighborhood. The man looked up, squinting in the morning sun. He was probably in his 70s, with weathered hands and a face that spoke of decades of hard work. You're here about the development. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Word travels fast around here. Meridian's been sending people through for months, taking pictures and making notes. We know what's coming. Maya looked around the garden. This is beautiful. How long have you been working on it? Started it 12 years ago. Right after we lost Maria. The man's voice was soft. She always said this neighborhood needed some green space, somewhere kids could play and families could gather. So we made it happen. Maria was your wife? Maria Santos. She was one of the first to settle here after the collapse. Helped organize the whole community. When the government didn't have resources to clear the rubble, Maria got people together to do it themselves. When there wasn't enough food, she started the first community garden. When the kids didn't have a school, she turned her living room into a classroom. Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She'd known people like Maria during the collapse, the ones who stepped up when everything fell apart, who became leaders not because they wanted power but because someone had to take responsibility. Most of them were gone now, claimed by disease or old age or the simple exhaustion of carrying the world on their shoulders for too long. What's your name? She asked. Roberto Santos. Maria's husband. Mr. Santos, what will you do if the development goes through? He shrugged. What can we do? They're offering money to relocate, but where are we supposed to go? This is our home. Our community. You can't just pack that up and move it somewhere else. Maya spent the next 2 hours walking through the neighborhood. She met Mrs. Patterson, who ran a small grocery store that had been serving the community for 8 years. She talked to Tom Rodriguez, who had organized the Neighborhood Watch program and knew every family on every street. She visited the community center, where teenagers were practicing for a play they were putting on next month. These weren't the faceless, low-income residents from the development proposal. These were people who had built something meaningful from nothing, who had created a community in the ruins of the old world. They were survivors, just like Maya, but they were the invisible kind, the ones who had survived not by fighting or leading, but by simply refusing to give up, by building something better one day at a time. As she walked back to her car, Maya's phone rang. It was David Chen from the planning office. Maya, where are you? Harrison's been asking for you. I'm finishing up at the development site. I'll be back soon. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up. Harrison's been talking to some people upstairs. He thinks you're becoming a problem. Maya stopped walking. What kind of problem? The kind that gets in the way of progress. The kind that asks too many questions and slows down approvals. Maya, I like you, but you need to be careful. The city's changing, and if you can't change with it, they'll find someone who can. I'm sorry. I just thought you should know. Maya hung up and stood in the middle of the street, looking back at the neighborhood she'd just visited. In the distance, she could see the downtown skyline, all glass and steel and promise. It was beautiful, she had to admit. It was everything they'd dreamed of building during those terrible years when the world had ended. But at what cost? She drove back to the office, her mind churning. The afternoon meeting was already in session when she arrived, and she could see through the glass walls of the conference room that Harrison was presenting the development proposal to a group of city council members. Everyone was nodding and smiling, clearly impressed by the renderings and statistics. Maya slipped into the back of the room just as Harrison was concluding his presentation. The economic impact alone makes this a no-brainer, he was saying. 50,000 new residents, 30,000 new jobs, billions in investment. It's exactly the kind of forward-thinking development that will keep New Haven competitive in the global economy. One of the council members, a woman Maya didn't recognize, raised her hand. What about the existing residents? I understand there are some concerns about displacement. Harrison's smile never wavered. We've done extensive outreach to the community. The relocation packages are quite generous, and we're confident that most residents will be better off in newer, more modern housing. Maya felt something snap inside her. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. That's not true. The room fell silent. Harrison's face flushed. Maya, perhaps you'd like to present your findings? She walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding. Behind her, she could hear David whisper, "Don't do it, Maya. Don't burn this bridge." But Maya was already past caring about bridges. She looked out at the faces around the table, young, earnest, well-meaning people who had never known what it was like to lose everything, to watch their world crumble and have to build it back from nothing. I spent this morning in the neighborhood you want to destroy, she said. I talked to the people who live there. Roberto Santos, who's been growing food for his community for 12 years. Mrs. Patterson, who kept her grocery store open even during the worst of the supply wars. Tom Rodriguez, who organized neighborhood patrols when the police couldn't protect anyone. She pulled out her tablet and projected photos she'd taken that morning, the community garden, the local businesses, the kids playing in the streets. These people are survivors, Maya continued. They lived through the collapse. They saw their city burn and their neighbors die, and they decided to build something better. And they did it without $12 billion in investment or AI modeling or environmental impact studies. They did it with their own hands and their own hearts. Harrison stepped forward. Maya, I think you're being emotional about this. We have to make decisions based on data, not sentiment. Data? Maya turned to face him. You want data? I'll give you data. 15 years ago, this city had a population of 2 million people. After the collapse, there were maybe 200,000 left. You know how we got from there to here? It wasn't because of development corporations or grand master plans. It was because people like Roberto Santos and Maria Santos decided to plant a garden in a vacant lot. It was because people like Mrs. Patterson decided to open a store even when there was no guarantee anyone would be able to pay for anything. She could see the discomfort on their faces. This wasn't the kind of conversation they wanted to have. The collapse was history, ancient history, something that had happened to other people in another time. The problem, Maya continued, is that you've forgotten what we survived. You think the city rebuilt itself, that progress is inevitable, that all we have to do is keep moving forward and everything will be fine. But that's not how it works. The reason we have anything at all is because when everything fell apart, people decided to take care of each other. They decided to build communities, not just buildings. Sarah spoke up from the back of the room. Maya, we're not trying to destroy communities. We're trying to create better ones. The new development will have state-of-the-art community centers, green spaces, educational facilities. Designed by whom? For whom? Maya shot back. You're talking about replacing a real community with a planned one. You're talking about moving people out of homes they built with their own hands and putting them in apartments designed by someone who's never met them. It's progress, Harrison said firmly. It's growth. It's what the city needs to remain competitive. Competitive with what? With whom? Maya felt her voice rising. We're not in competition with anyone. We're trying to build a place where people can live and work and raise their families. We're trying to build a home. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. Some were confused, some were annoyed, some were embarrassed. None of them understood what she was talking about. You know what I think? Maya said. I think you're afraid. I think you're afraid of what we survived, afraid of what we're capable of. Because if you really understood what happened 15 years ago, if you really understood what it took to rebuild this city, you'd realize that the people you want to displace are the same people who saved all of us. Harrison's voice was cold. Maya, I think you need to take some time to consider whether you're the right fit for this department. No, Maya said. I don't think I am. She gathered her things and walked out of the conference room. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of conversation resuming, the sound of people trying to pretend that nothing had happened, that the uncomfortable truth she'd just spoken could be ignored. Maya drove home through the city streets, past the gleaming towers and the carefully manicured parks. Everything was so clean, so orderly, so perfect. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing, that in all their planning and building and progressing, they'd forgotten the most important thing of all. They'd forgotten what it meant to be human. That evening, Maya sat in her apartment, staring out at the city lights. Her phone had been ringing all afternoon, David calling to check on her, Sarah calling to apologize, even Jake calling to say he hoped she'd reconsider. But Maya didn't want to talk to any of them. She wanted to think. She pulled out a photo album she kept in her bedroom closet, one of the few things she'd managed to save from the old world. The pictures showed a different city, a different time. There was her old apartment building, where she'd lived with her husband Marcus before the collapse. There was the park where they'd had their first date, the restaurant where they'd celebrated their anniversary, the hospital where Marcus had died during the plague years. Maya had been 27 when the world ended. She'd been an architect then, working for a firm that designed luxury condos and office buildings. She'd thought she was building the future. She'd had no idea that the future would require tearing everything down first. The collapse had started slowly, then accelerated beyond anyone's ability to control it. Climate change had made large parts of the planet uninhabitable. Resource wars had destroyed global trade networks. A series of engineered plagues had killed hundreds of millions. And then, in the space of 6 months, everything had simply fallen apart. Maya had survived because she'd been lucky and because she'd learned to adapt. When the power grid failed, she'd learned to live without electricity. When the food distribution system collapsed, she'd learned to grow her own vegetables. When the government stopped functioning, she'd learned to organize her own community. But mostly, she'd survived because of people like Marcus, who had given his life working in the makeshift hospitals during the plague years. People like Maria Santos, who had organized neighborhood cleanup crews and food distribution networks. People like Roberto Santos, who had taught children how to read when there were no schools and how to grow food when there were no stores. They had been ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. They had taken responsibility for each other when no one else would. They had built something from nothing, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And now, 15 years later, their children and grandchildren were embarrassed by them. The survivors had become an inconvenience, a reminder of an unpleasant past that everyone wanted to forget. Maya closed the photo album and made a decision. The next morning, she didn't go to the city planning office. Instead, she drove back to the Eastern District, to the neighborhood that was slated for demolition. She found Roberto Santos in his garden, watering the tomatoes in the early morning light. "Mr. Santos," she said, "I want to help you fight this development." He looked up, surprised. "I thought you worked for the city." "I did. Not anymore." Maya knelt down beside him, her hands touching the rich soil. Tell me what you need. Over the next few weeks, Maya threw herself into organizing the neighborhood's resistance to the development. She helped Roberto Santos and the other community leaders form a residents' association. She researched the city's zoning laws and environmental regulations. She reached out to journalists and activists and anyone else who might be willing to listen. It wasn't easy. The neighborhood didn't have much money or political influence. Meridian Corporation had teams of lawyers and lobbyists working to push the development through. The city council was enthusiastic about the project, and the local media was largely supportive. But Maya had something the developers didn't have: she knew what the community was really worth. She organized tours of the neighborhood for city council members, showing them the community garden and the local businesses and the network of relationships that had taken years to build. She brought in experts to testify about the value of existing communities versus planned developments. She mobilized the teenagers at the community center to speak at public meetings about what the neighborhood meant to them. And slowly, gradually, she began to change minds. The first breakthrough came when Councilwoman Rodriguez, one of the younger council members who had initially supported the development, visited the neighborhood and spent an afternoon talking to residents. She met Mrs. Patterson, who had kept her store open during the worst of the supply wars, extending credit to families who couldn't pay and organizing barter networks when money became worthless. She met Tom Rodriguez, who had organized the Neighborhood Watch program and knew every family on every street. She met the teenagers who were practicing for their play, who had written their own script about the history of their community. "I had no idea," Councilwoman Rodriguez told Maya afterward. "I thought we were just talking about replacing some old buildings. I didn't realize we were talking about dismantling a community." The second breakthrough came when a local journalist named Elena Vasquez wrote a series of articles about the neighborhood. Elena was young, maybe 30, but she had grown up in New Haven and remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about the collapse. She understood that the people Maya was fighting for weren't just statistics in a development proposal, they were the people who had built the city from the ground up. Elena's articles caught the attention of other media outlets, and soon the story was spreading beyond New Haven. National news organizations picked up the story of the neighborhood that was fighting to save itself from progress. Social media campaigns began using the hashtag #RememberWhatWeSurvived. The third breakthrough came when other survivors began to speak out. Maya had thought she was alone, that she was the only one who remembered what the collapse had really been like. But Elena's articles had awakened something in the city's older residents. They began to share their own stories, their own memories of what it had been like to rebuild from nothing. They talked about the community kitchens that had fed thousands during the hungry years. They talked about the neighborhood clinics that had operated without government funding or official sanction. They talked about the schools that had been organized in people's living rooms and the libraries that had been built from salvaged books. Most importantly, they talked about the people who had made it all possible, the Maria Santoses and the Mrs. Pattersons and the Tom Rodriguezes who had stepped up when everything fell apart. Director Harrison called Maya 3 weeks after she'd left the planning office. She was in the community center, helping Roberto Santos organize a presentation for the next city council meeting, when her phone rang. "Maya, we need to talk. I don't work for you anymore, Director. The city council is reconsidering the development proposal. They want to hear from the planning department about alternative options." Maya felt a surge of hope. "What kind of alternatives?" "I don't know. That's what we need to discuss. Maya, you know this neighborhood better than anyone. We need your expertise." "My expertise? 3 weeks ago, you said I was being emotional and sentimental." There was a long pause. 3 weeks ago, I didn't understand what was at stake. I've been reading the news coverage, and I've been talking to some of the older residents in other parts of the city. I'm starting to realize that maybe I've been thinking about this wrong. Maya looked around the community center, at the hand-painted murals on the walls and the mismatched furniture that had been donated by families throughout the neighborhood. "I'll come to the meeting. But I have conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "I want Roberto Santos there. I want Mrs. Patterson and Tom Rodriguez and Elena Vasquez. I want the people who actually live here to be part of the conversation." Maya, that's not how these meetings usually work. Then maybe it's time to change how these meetings work. The city council meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in late October. Maya arrived early with Roberto Santos and the other community leaders, and she was surprised to find the council chambers packed with people. There were residents from the Eastern District, but also people from all over the city, other survivors, younger people who had been following the story, activists and journalists, and ordinary citizens who had come to show their support. Director Harrison was there, along with Jake and Sarah and David from the planning department. The representatives from Meridian Corporation were there too, with their lawyers and their polished presentation materials. But as Maya looked around the room, she realized that something fundamental had changed. The people who had come to support the neighborhood weren't just there to oppose a development project. They were there to make a statement about what kind of city they wanted to live in. Councilwoman Rodriguez called the meeting to order. We're here tonight to reconsider the proposed New Horizon development in the Eastern District. We've heard from the developers, we've heard from the planning department, and now we want to hear from the community. Roberto Santos spoke first. He was nervous, Maya could tell, but his voice was steady as he talked about the garden he'd built in memory of his wife, about the community that had grown up around it, about the children who had learned to read in the community center and the families who had found work through the neighborhood networks. You want to know what this place is worth, he said. It's worth everything. It's worth the lives of the people who died to build it. It's worth the dreams of the people who live here now. It's worth the future of the children who will grow up here. Mrs. Patterson spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the silent chamber. She talked about keeping her store open during the worst of the supply wars, about feeding families who couldn't pay, about creating a place where people could come not just to buy groceries but to connect with their neighbors. Tom Rodriguez talked about the Neighborhood Watch program, about getting to know every family on every street, about creating a sense of safety and belonging that couldn't be replicated in any planned development. And then Elena Vasquez spoke about the stories she'd heard while researching her articles, about the history that was embedded in every street corner and every building, about the invisible network of relationships that held the community together. What we're talking about here, Elena said, isn't just about one neighborhood. It's about what kind of city we want to be. Do we want to be a place where communities can grow organically, where people can build something meaningful together? Or do we want to be a place where everything is planned and managed and optimized by people who have never lived here? When the community presentations were finished, the Meridian Corporation representatives made their case. They talked about economic development and job creation and environmental sustainability. They showed their renderings and their statistics and their projections. But Maya could see that the mood in the room had changed. The council members were asking different questions now, harder questions about community impact and long-term sustainability and what would happen to the people who would be displaced. Finally, it was Maya's turn to speak. She stood at the podium and looked out at the packed chamber, at the faces of people who had come to support a cause they believed in. 15 years ago, she said, this city was dying. Not declining, not struggling, dying. The population had collapsed, the infrastructure had failed, the government had stopped functioning. By every measure that mattered, New Haven was finished. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the room. But we didn't die. We survived. And we survived because people like Roberto Santos and Maria Santos and Mrs. Patterson and Tom Rodriguez decided that they weren't going to let their community disappear. They decided that they were going to build something better, not because someone told them to, but because they chose to. Maya looked directly at the council members. You want to know what this neighborhood is worth? It's worth everything we've built since the collapse. It's worth the proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide to take care of each other. It's worth the knowledge that we can survive anything, that we can build anything, that we are capable of more than we ever imagined. She turned back to the packed chamber. They forgot what we survived. They forgot what it took to build this city back from nothing. They forgot that the reason we have anything at all is because people decided to take responsibility for each other, to build communities, to create homes. Her voice grew stronger. But we haven't forgotten. We remember what it was like when everything fell apart. We remember what it took to put it back together. And we remember what we're capable of when we work together. The room erupted in applause. People were standing, clapping, shouting their support. Maya could see tears in Roberto Santos's eyes, could see Mrs. Patterson nodding her head, could see the young people from the community center cheering. But she wasn't finished. This isn't just about saving one neighborhood, Maya continued when the applause died down. This is about remembering who we are. This is about understanding that progress isn't about tearing down the old to build the new. Progress is about building on what we have, honoring what we've accomplished, and creating something even better. She looked at Director Harrison, at the representatives from Meridian Corporation, at the young planners who had called her a ghost. You want to build something in this city? Then build it with the people who live here. Build it with the people who survived the collapse and rebuilt from nothing. Build it with the people who know what it means to create a community, not just design one. The applause this time was deafening. It went on for several minutes, and Maya could see that some of the council members were clapping too. Even Director Harrison was nodding his head. When the room finally quieted, Councilwoman Rodriguez called for a vote. The motion to approve the New Horizon development failed by a margin of 7-2. But then something unexpected happened. Councilman Williams, an older man who had been on the council for 20 years, stood up to speak. I want to propose something, he said. I want to propose that we work with the Eastern District community to develop a different kind of plan. A plan that builds on what's already there, that honors what's already been accomplished, that creates something new while preserving what's valuable about what already exists. He looked at Maya. I'd like to ask Maya Chen to head up this planning effort. She clearly understands both the community and the planning process, and she's shown that she's willing to fight for what's right. Maya felt her heart skip a beat. She looked at Roberto Santos, who was nodding encouragingly. She looked at Mrs. Patterson, who was smiling. She looked at the young people from the community center, who were grinning and giving her thumbs up. I'd be honored, Maya said. The motion to create a community-led planning process passed unanimously. As the meeting ended and people began to file out of the chamber, Maya found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Elena Vasquez was there, taking notes for her follow-up story. Director Harrison was there, looking slightly shell-shocked but willing to shake hands. Jake and Sarah and David were there, looking uncertain but interested in learning more about this new approach to planning. But the person Maya was most happy to see was Roberto Santos. He came up to her with tears in his eyes and took her hands in his weathered ones. Maria would have been proud, he said quietly. She always said that the most important thing wasn't the buildings we built or the programs we created. It was the people we became in the process of building and creating. Maya felt tears welling up in her own eyes. Mr. Santos, I want you to know that I didn't do this alone. Everyone in this room did this. Everyone who came tonight, everyone who shared their story, everyone who refused to let this community be erased, they all did this. I know, Roberto said. That's what makes it so beautiful. That's what makes it so much like the old days, when we were rebuilding from nothing. We did it together then, and we're still doing it together now. Over the next several months, Maya worked with the community to develop a new kind of development plan. Instead of tearing down the existing neighborhood, they designed a process that would build on what was already there. New housing would be integrated with existing homes. New businesses would complement existing ones. New community spaces would be built in partnership with existing organizations. It wasn't easy. There were conflicts about priorities and resources. There were disagreements about what kinds of changes were acceptable and what kinds crossed the line. There were moments when Maya wondered if they were being too ambitious, if they were trying to do something that couldn't be done. But every time she started to doubt, she would remember that night in the council chambers. She would remember the faces of the people who had come to support the community, who had stood up to say that some things were worth preserving, that some kinds of progress were worth fighting for. And she would remember Roberto Santos's words, "We did it together then, and we're still doing it together now." The planning process took 2 years. There were dozens of community meetings, hundreds of individual conversations, thousands of small decisions that had to be made collectively. Maya found herself learning as much as she was teaching, discovering new approaches to planning that she had never encountered in her formal training. The young planners from her old office, Jake and Sarah and David, became regular participants in the process. At first, they were skeptical of the community-led approach, but gradually they began to see the value in involving residents in every aspect of the planning process. "It's slower," Jake admitted to Maya one evening as they were reviewing the latest set of design proposals. "But it's also more creative. The solutions we're coming up with are things none of us would have thought of on our own." "That's the point," Maya said. "When you include the people who actually live in a place, you get better solutions. You get ideas that work in the real world, not just on paper." Sarah, who had initially been the most skeptical of the community-led approach, became one of its strongest advocates. "I've learned more about planning in the last 2 years than I did in 6 years of graduate school," she told Maya. "And I've learned more about what cities are actually for." "What are they for?" Maya asked. "They're for people. Real people, with real lives and real relationships and real dreams. They're not just machines for economic development or showcases for architectural innovation. They're homes." The final plan was unveiled at a community celebration in the Eastern District. It preserved the existing community garden and expanded it into a network of green spaces throughout the neighborhood. It kept the local businesses and helped them grow. It maintained the community center and built new ones. It added new housing, but in a way that complemented the existing architecture and maintained the neighborhood's character. Most importantly, it created a governance structure that would keep the community involved in all future decisions about the neighborhood's development. Maya stood in the community garden, watching families and neighbors celebrate together. Children were playing on the playground equipment that had been built by volunteers from throughout the city. Teenagers were performing scenes from their latest play, which told the story of the neighborhood's successful fight to save itself. Adults were sharing food and stories and laughter. Roberto Santos came up to her, carrying a small potted plant. "This is for you," he said. "It's a tomato plant, grown from seeds that Maria saved 20 years ago. I want you to have it." Maya took the plant, feeling its weight in her hands. "Mr. Santos, I can't accept this. This belongs here, in the community garden." "No," Roberto said firmly. "This belongs with you. You're part of this community now, and this plant is part of your family. Take it home, grow it, save the seeds. And when you plant those seeds, remember what we accomplished together." Maya looked around the garden, at the celebration happening around her, at the neighborhood that had been saved and transformed and made stronger. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the sterile conference rooms of the planning office to this vibrant community space. She thought about the young planners who had learned to see cities as homes rather than just economic engines. She thought about the council members who had learned to value community input over corporate presentations. She thought about the journalists and activists and ordinary citizens who had stood up to say that some things were worth preserving.